Today, my guest is co-author Brett Witter, who, with Vicki Myron, wrote Dewey's 9 Lives, the legacy of the small-town library cat who inspired millions. Now, I'm just so happy that Brett is with us today. Vicki could not be here, but I'm sure she's going to be listening to the show. She had a terrible cold, could not be interviewed, but we're going to be talking about her and about her book. Now, the book is from Dutton, a division of the Penguin Group, and this is a true story. Vicki and Brett are the authors also of the best-selling, the first book, Dewey, the small-town library cat who touched the world. It sold over 1 million copies in hardcover, spawned 3 children's books, and became the basis for a film adaptation that is currently in development with Meryl Streep in the lead role. That ain't bad for a small-town gal from Middle America, Iowa. Well, Brett, welcome to the show, and thanks for pitch hitting.
Thank you.
Well, it's great to have you here. Brett, now you've collaborated with Vicki since 2006. You currently live in Louisville, Kentucky with your wife and children. Why don't we start out by telling us how you got to collaborating with Vicki?
Well, it actually came about through our literary agent who had heard about Dewey and really liked the story and called me up and said, well, I've got a woman, a librarian in a small town in Iowa who has a great story about her cat. Would be interested in working on it. And I told him, well, no way. That doesn't sound like a book. But he said, well, Vicki's really interested in talking with you about it. I found out later that wasn't particularly true. She was looking for a writer, but she thought, well, he's a man and he's half my age and he lives in Kentucky. What's he going to know about cats in Spencer, Iowa? But we got on the phone and we talked for 4 hours and really hit it off. And I just loved Vicki and her wonderful attitude about life. And I loved Dewey and his incredible life. And we decided to work together, and we've been working together ever since. And
how exciting is it for you that it's going to be a movie with Meryl Streep, of all people?
Well, I mean, it's tremendously exciting. It's tremendously frustrating because it keeps, the movie business, it keeps being put off and that, and there's so many people involved, but that's the one thing Vicki's really gotten excited about. When she heard that, she just sort of hit the ceiling with excitement.
Well, I think any woman would be excited if Meryl Streep were going to play her life, don't you think so?
I think it's an honor. It's definitely an honor.
It really is. Well, let's start out about Dewey's 9 Lives. Now, this is the second book, and as the title implies, it is a collection of 9 stories, including 2 about Dewey, that have not been published before. But let's start out by, first of all, give an overview of the story. And when did Dewey leave us?
Dewey, well, I can tell you when he arrived. It was actually just the winter of 1989, just after Christmas. And Vicki Myron, who was the librarian in the small town in Iowa, Spencer, Iowa, went on a Monday morning to get the books out of the book drop. The library had been closed for the weekend, and when she went to get the books, there was a very tiny kitten inside. It was very dirty and very cold, and she took the kitten inside and warmed it up, and it was just a gorgeous, beautiful, friendly cat, and she ended up adopting it, and it lived there in the library in Spencer, Iowa for 19 years. Dewey died it was actually 2007.
Yes.
Just after Thanksgiving.
Well, I'm not a cat owner. I love cats. Sadly, I'm allergic to them. But is it typical for a cat to live that long? 19 years?
That's a long life for a cat.
I thought so.
It's not totally unusual, but it's like living into your 90s.
Yeah.
If you're a human being.
Well,
and it's especially difficult for a cat who's in the public so much. Dewey lived every day in the library, and he dealt with hundreds of people every day.
But maybe that's what made him live so long. He was so happy with all of that attention and all those people to take care of. I mean,
that could definitely be the case.
Yeah.
He loved his job, as they say, as the official greeter at the library.
Well, yes. Well, before we do the overview of this book, Dewey's 9 Lives, can you give a little overview of what the first book entailed? And then we'll give an overview of the second one. As I already said, it's short stories, but if there's anything more you want to add to that. But what about the first book? What period did that cover?
Well, it really covered from the late 80s up until Dewey's death in 2007. And I think, at its core, it was a cat book. It was a story about, people who have cats could recognize Dewey's antics, whether it was his love of chasing rubber bands, and snacking on them, unfortunately, or his popping up in unusual high places and sleeping in boxes and getting on the copier because it was so warm and refusing to let anyone make copies.
Yeah, you have to giggle over some of that. And
absolutely. It was a very funny book, and he was a funny cat.
Yes.
But it was also the story of a small town in middle America, a farming town that was struggling with the new era of big farms, and a lot of people have been put out of business, particularly when Dewey came along in the 1980s. It was the middle of the farm crisis, and the town was very much struggling. They'd lost most of their businesses and actually about 30% of their population because there was no jobs. And it's about how Dewey sort of integrated into that town's sense of pride, that they weren't going to give up and they were going to find a way to continue.
Now, where were you living at the time you worked on this book with Vicki?
I was living in Louisville.
You were in Louisville.
That's where I live.
Yeah.
I traveled to Spencer and I've spent about 6 weeks there total over the last couple of years.
Well, then I imagine you have a pretty good feeling about the town. Do you think, and we're talking about actually both books because this is kind of a spin-off
yes.
as a result of that first book, but do you think that such a story could have happened elsewhere, or was there something about Spencer, Iowa, that represents the best of small-town America? Did you get any feeling for what was it that was able to pull these people together in such a way where other towns might have just collapsed, imploded, so to speak?
Well, I think there's a lot of small towns like Spencer. I just have that feeling. But what I think pulled them together was very deep roots that people had in that area, and the sense that the town was important, that they couldn't go somewhere else and maintain the history and the lifestyle and the friendships that they had in Spencer. And I think anytime you have people take that kind of pride in the place they live, whether it's a small town or a big city or a rural, a farm, I think there really is power in that. And Spencer is, I'm not from Iowa. I'm amazed how far from anywhere it is.
Oh, yes, I looked on a map and I was amazed too. I've never been to Iowa, but I know people who have been, and that's what they all say. You travel miles and miles and miles and see nothing.
Just, it's 100 miles to anything from there.
100 miles to anything?
Anything besides corn and soybeans.
Whoa, I'd have trouble with that.
And it's not been easy there. I mean, they in the Great Depression, most of the town burned down in a terrible fire.
Oh my!
In the 1950s, the entire small farm-based agriculture collapsed, and Vicki, who grew up on a farm 14 miles from Spencer, her family lost their farm. A lot of people lost their farm, and then in the 80s again, there was another collapse in farming communities. So they had gone through a lot of hard times. But having survived the previous ones, I think they said they just sort of, they didn't physically sit down together, but they sort of all sat down at their own kitchen table.
Yeah, it's kind of that pioneer spirit by the sound of it. I mean, and it seems to me that with one thing right after another happening like that, people would finally say, well, I give up, I got to go somewhere else. But on the other hand, the land and, as you say, the people kind of held them there. So that's a wonderful story about the town itself as well as Dewey. But let's talk about the magic of Dewey. Now, his full name is Dewey Read More Books. What is it that, first of all, I've read in the literature that it was the town that named Dewey. Do you know how that came about by any chance?
Sure. It's well, Vicki named him temporarily Dewey because they needed a name for him.
Yeah, Dewey Decimal System.
She was the director of the library, and as I said, the town was going through hard times. And
right.
She's a big believer in libraries, and always felt, well, this can be a town center. This can be a community center to pull people together. So she said, well, why don't we have a naming contest for our cat? And they put it on a local radio station, and they put a box by the door, and she was really big on contests. They'd give away TVs, and they'd have 30 entries.
I would have loved her as my librarian.
And when they did the Name the Cat contest, they had like 750 entries.
Oh, my goodness.
Which is a tremendous amount for a small town like that.
How many people actually live there?
Well, the town itself at that time had about 9,000 people.
Uh-huh.
That's a lot of people.
Well, yeah, it's not a teeny tiny little town, but it's a small town.
The whole area. It's sort of the center of a big geographic area and all the farms around. It's sort of the central town in that area. And it was a central library in that area, so they were drawing people from the whole town.
Sure. So there were over 700 entries.
That's
and
correct.
Then how was the winner selected?
Well, of those 700 entries, over 50 of them voted for Dewey.
Uh-huh.
Because that was that they had already been calling him Dewey, and they didn't want to change it.
Yeah, I don't think they even use the Dewey Decimal System anymore in libraries since it's all on computers.
Probably not.
Yeah, I think there's another way of cataloging.
But yes, they got the Dewey, but then the librarian said, "Well, Dewey, how can you just be Dewey?" So then they came up with this.
Read more books. I love it. Read More Books is his last name. Well, Brett, tell us about the magic of Dewey, and what was it about him? And I mean, he was a cat, like you said. We've seen other cats do certain things, and it's so cute and everything. But what was it about him that spoke to the world and put it on the bestseller list for 34 weeks? I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Yes, it's very amazing. But I think it was his empathy, for lack of a better word, because he's a cat, and I don't want to make him out to be a person. But
no, but you can see it in his face on the cover of the book. He's got a look in his eyes.
Sense about people that needed something.
Yeah.
That needed a cat, and he had a way of, he would jump on their laps, or he would go to them. There's a story in the second book, we didn't get into the first book, about a woman who lived in the town who was very, very quiet and somewhat disabled and didn't really talk to anybody, but had this relationship with Dewey where she would come in and play with him all the time and throw balls with him, and he'd come up to her and beg her to let him into the bathroom, and they'd go in there and she'd turn on the water for him and he'd play with it. But then one day she came in and he just kind of stopped and realized something was different, and she went and she sat down, and instead of asking her to play, he just came up and sat on her lap and sat there for 2 hours. And he was sort of the only one in town who realized her cat had died the previous day, and she was very, very close with this cat. It was sort of her only real companion in her life. And Dewey was the only one that had this sense that she was just heartbroken and needed something, and just having him sit there on her lap really helped her. And 10 years later, she came up to Vicki and told her that story. After the first book came out, Vicki had never
mentioned
that story,
it,
but that came up to Vicki and told her that.
Oh.
It was still so important to her, and it's sort of moments like this that Vicki realized, wow, he had this incredible. I was with him every day, but he also had this incredible other life where he just helped so many people.
But she didn't say anything for 10 years. She didn't tell
for 10 years.
For 10 years.
Well, she was very quiet. She never spoke to anyone.
Was that Yvonne Barry?
And that's right.
Yes.
That's right.
Yeah, her cat Toby.
Yeah, she never spoke to anyone of the library. The only person she ever spoke to was Dewey, and they'd play, and she'd sort of talk to him.
Brett Witter is currently working on a book called Until Tuesday, And I'm going to have him give a brief little mention as to what that's about. That book is coming out in June from Hyperion, which is part of Disney. So we definitely know there's going to be a movie in the works there, and I will have Brett on the show at the time. Brett, this is a wonderful book that you're working on. Can you just tell us who Tuesday is and what the book is about?
Well, Tuesday is a service dog, and he is the partner, I guess you could say, of a wounded Iraq veteran named Luis Carlos Montalvan, who served 2 tours in Iraq and has some spinal injuries and a traumatic head injury and some PTSD. And they've been together for 2 years now, and Tuesday has kind of rescued him from a very bad situation he was in with his health, and they are now out speaking a lot for veterans issues.
That's wonderful.
For helping other people.
Well, I can hardly wait for that book. So that's next June that we have to wait for. But we're definitely, I'm booking you as we speak. So good
Thank
luck
you.
on that.
Well, they will appreciate it.
Yes. Well, okay. Let's go back to Dewey, our wonderful little cat. Now, I know Vicki thought that with the success of the first book, and maybe you thought the same thing, that was the end of the Dewey stories, but what convinced you both otherwise that another book was in the making?
Well, the first thing was that Vicki's had this incredible experience after the first book was published. And I don't know whether I should give it away or not, but she had a very tough time after Dewey's death with her health. She had a lot of health issues, and she ended up finding 2 new stray cats in her life with Dewey's help, as she said. One of them, a stray cat who came to her life very much like Dewey. Someone found him in the middle of the road, covered in ice and sticks and near death, and rescued him. And the other, a man.
Well, we shouldn't tell that yet. Let's hold back on that part.
Yes.
We'll get into that a little later.
Great.
Because that really is a great story. But so she did rescue this other cat.
It felt like about a quarter of a book.
Mm-hmm.
It felt like something she said, I think people will be interested in this.
Mm-hmm.
But this was about 6 to 9 months after the first book came out, and this was 9 months of her calling me up and saying, Brett, you should read these letters that I'm getting from people who are so moved by Dewey's story, and they have these incredible stories of their own cats, and she'd read them to me over the phone. And you kept doing this and hearing these incredible stories, and Vicki was so moved by them, and I was so moved by them, that ultimately we realized, wait a second, there's incredible stories to share here that, why is it just us? We could share them with other people out there, and they could be just as moved and touched and helped in their lives by these stories as we are.
Well, now, was the first book also published by Dutton, which is a division of the Penguin Group? Was that the same publisher? So they got behind that book, obviously, the first book.
Right, yes.
Yes. And I'm glad they did. They knew that there was something special. So when did you then? How long did it take before you presented it again to Dutton, the idea of the second book?
It was probably, I think it was about 9 months
after
the first book came out, and they had been asking, for another book for a while, and we finally said, well, how about this? And it was all dependent on the stories that could be gotten, really.
Sure.
And they were nice enough to take a chance that the book would be good, and I think, and I think everybody's very pleased with the way it came out, because Vicki and I met 9 extraordinary people and 9 extraordinary cats.
Well, and it's a great title too, the play on the cat's 9 lives.
That's
so
right.
It's about Dewey's 9 lives, and it's 9 stories.
And it's also about the way Dewey's legacy has lived on after the first book.
Exactly.
If you spend any time with Vicki, you would know that she doesn't feel like Dewey is gone.
Probably isn't. He's hanging around.
His influence and his spirit is still with her and with a lot of other people, and she really feels like the good things that happened to her. She says, "Well, I'm not anybody, but Dewey was special, and good things that happen are because of Dewey." And so this, we feel like, and she feels like these 9 people came into her life because of Dewey.
Well, I believe It's like, who is that little character in the Disney movie, the little fairy, we believe, and cat people and dog people, I think, would say the same thing. Now, so you had to whittle it down to these 9 stories, but I'm sure she must have had hundreds, and if not thousands, of letters from people, didn't she?
There were about 3,000 letters.
Yeah. My goodness. So you had to go through that. And did the two of you make the selection, or how did that work? Just very briefly.
We whittled it down to about 30 people, and then we started calling them and talking with them. And obviously, some people weren't interested in telling their story, and other people were. Almost everybody was. But then we ended up just sort of narrowing it down through talking with them to 9 people that we thought had excellent stories, that we thought when you put these 9 stories together, they'll form a book. It won't sound like the same 9 stories every time. Mm-hmm. They're very different people with different cats, but they each had sort of an incredible experience, an incredible lesson to impart.
Well, I think all of the stories are wonderful, but I was really intrigued by the story of Bill Benzinson. Yes, a traumatized Vietnam vet who he wandered the country changing jobs and formed few attachments, and one day while fixing his car, something amazing happened. Tell that.
Well, he was actually waiting at a stoplight to go to his job in California, and something fell on his car.
Something fell out of the sky.
Vietnam, so he ducked. He thought it was like a mortar shell coming.
Oh, I bet.
Or something, and he got out of the car and he looked, and there was this kitten with this terrible blood on his car, and this kitten had fallen onto his car. They found out later there was a talon puncture in the cat's wound, in the cat's lung, and they think an owl must have grabbed it.
Oh, my.
And accidentally dropped it. It was, for some reason, it was flying by. And fortunately, from Vietnam, he knew how to bandage the sucking chest and bandaged up the cat and took it to a vet, and it survived. And now it turned out to be an incredible survivor, kind of adventurous cat. It survived. It later survived a bear attack, an attack from 4 coyotes, and an angry woman who took it away and drove it to a dump and dropped it off 25 miles from its home, and it found its way back.
My goodness. Well, that's a pretty angry woman to do that to somebody's cat.
Yeah, it was a landlord situation.
Gee. What was the cat's name? I've forgotten what the cat.
His name was Spooky.
Spooky. Well, that's
because
a good name.
When he was bandaging him up, said, "I can't believe this cat survived. It's very spooky that this cat survived." So they called him Spooky, and it was this sort of incredibly adventurous survivor cat, and it sort of pulled Bill, who had trouble readjusting to life back in the United States and had been very much sort of on his own in his own world without being able to form attachments for a long time, and sort of pulled him into this relationship that ultimately, pulled him back into regular society in the world.
By this little kitten. But it is pretty amazing when you stop to think of it, that something drops out of the sky and it's this living thing.
Yeah.
And it was meant to be. I guess we have to say it was meant to be.
I've never heard a better story than that of how somebody got a cat into their lives.
Well, yes, that's what drew me to it. But then we have another terrific story in here, and probably the most beautiful story is the one about Glenn Albertson and Rusty and Dewey. Why don't you tell us about Glenn and what he had been going through and something that happened along the way?
Well, I've met Glenn in person, and he's a very large man with a beard, and he looks like he'd be intimidating, but he is sort of the kindest, gentlest, and most caring person, one of the most caring people I've ever met. And he grew up in Sioux City, Iowa, and he had run into some trouble because he'd gotten married in high school, and the marriage had ended very badly, and he'd actually gone through, by the time he was 60, he'd gone through 2 other wives, and really felt let down, like he had failed as a husband and father, because he had a couple of children, and they had kind of gone with their mothers and weren't speaking to him much anyway, and in his own way felt withdrawn from that human connection in the same way that Bill did. And he was a real car guy, so he had loved this I'm going to get the name of the car wrong, but I think it was like a Dodge Challenger or something.
Well, that's all right. It was a car he loved.
From the 1950s, and it was this car that he loved as a child, and he found one. He saw one in a junkyard, and somebody brought it to his house, and it turns out a cat came along with that car. He didn't realize it, but he was working underneath the dashboard, and this cat plopped down out of the car onto his chest, and he said, "Oh, hey, Rusty, how are you?" Because the cat looked rusty, like the rusty car.
Uh-huh.
And they ended up being these great buddies. Sort of Glenn, plays guitar and harmonica and stuff, and he'd have little jam sessions with the cat and everything, and sort of and got really got to be really buddies with this cat.
Well, that cat chose him, didn't he?
That's
Rusty
right.
chose him.
Sort of,
yeah.
These are almost two parallel stories of guys that were a little withdrawn. These cats sort of dropping into their lives, Glenn and Bill. And I think the amazing thing about Glenn, and obviously the reason he happens to be in this book, is because he met someone else, a woman who had an alcoholic husband and been divorced for 35 years, and had herself sort of given up on meeting a man to have in her life as a husband, and they ended up meeting at a dance in Nebraska, and really hitting it off and really talking about their cats.
Mm-hmm.
Again and again and again, having long conversations about their cats, and ultimately ended up getting married. And that other woman, of course, was Vicki Myron, Dewey's mommy.
So a great story for both of them.
And they're in sort of, I don't know, it's just such a happy story that they found each other.
Yes, and Dewey was still alive
brought
then.
Them together.
Yeah, but Dewey was still living. Is that correct at the time? Because Dewey was
not
involved.
Living. This was after.
This was? Okay.
Dewey had died, and then we had written. This was shortly after the book had been written, which was a pretty hard experience for Vicki, because it was very positive, but it was also a little bit sad to remember those times.
Yeah.
With Dewey, and it was very hard on her health. That's another sort of element of the first book. Is
right.
That Vicki
Right. Well,
has a great attitude, but a hard life, and this sort of relationship with Glenn sort of brought her back.
Yes. Well, I want to quickly, do you know the website? Can you give the website where people can learn more about Dewey? Do you know it?
www.deweyreadmorebooks.com.
Yes. Okay. Anybody that wants to
name.
learn more. And again, very, very quickly, all of the animal shelters have been overwhelmed with animals that have been abandoned due to the economy. Do you or did Vicki have any advice to listeners that may be reluctant to adopt a cat?
Just do it. I think that would be the best advice. You will not be disappointed. If you open yourself up to the experience of having a cat, they can be extraordinarily caring and helpful animals.
And especially if you read the stories in this book, Dewey's 9 Lives, The Legacy of the Small-Town Library Cat Who Inspired Millions, and its previous book. Well, I have to say goodbye. Again, we are out of time. I'm looking forward to seeing the movie with Meryl Streep and give my best to Vicki. And Brett, good luck on the book you're working on, Brett. I can hardly wait to read that one. And
Thank you.
I look forward to having you on my show. So nice having you here now. Bye now.
Thank you very much.